I'm Bill Steele with the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, and I'm here with David Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt is a geodeticist who has been looking at the Cascadia subduction zone and deformation of the Cascadia margin in general. And we have some questions today. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Happy to answer.
So we have another episode of what we call deep tremor, or this kind of rumbling deep along the Cascadia interface under the Olympic Peninsula. Started up about a week ago and seems to have calmed down a little bit today, but it brought up a lot of questions about what's going on down there.
Yeah, so this recent event started about a week ago, and it's a recurring event. So this is last occurred about a year ago. So we expected this event to occur around this time frame, and sure enough, it's appeared, which makes it somewhat unusual compared to other earthquakes that we see, because most earthquakes don't have a nice recurrence or repeatability.
Right.
So how we know something is happening is from two sources of information. We can see movement on the Earth's surface from instruments called GPS instruments, and they're able to see a very small amount of movement on the order of a couple millimeters to a centimeter of movement of the Earth's surface associated with these events. And we also know that they're occurring because on seismometers we can see a phenomenon which we call tremor. And it looks like a steady wobbling of the instrument that we see over lots of instruments in the area. So those are the two data sources we know that something interesting is happening.
So this subtle rumbling or wobbling that we're seeing on our sensitive seismographs, how long does it take for the motion that's occurring there at depth to kind of show up in the geodetic data?
Right, so when one of these events starts up, it starts small and it tends to grow over a broad area. So, you know, it probably starts in a small region of maybe 300 feet or so, and grows to a bigger and bigger patch down on the fault until it's stretching more like 100 miles wide. So it takes time to grow. And as it's growing, more moment is being released. In those initial stages, all of the energy that's released is quite concentrated in a small region. And we can only see that on the seismometers.
Okay.
It takes a while for that signal to grow big enough that we see it on the other instruments, the GPS instruments. And that takes about 3 days for that to show up.
And these events tend to last around 2 weeks to a month in duration usually?
Right, yes, because they take time to move across the region. So
and at the end of that period of time, however long that ends up being, what is the moment release generally at the end in terms of magnitude that we might understand released by an earthquake?
Yeah, so there's a range of magnitudes we see from these events, but the largest events we see in Cascadia are about a six and a half, equivalent to a 6.5 of an earthquake.
Yeah, so it's a lot. But a 6.5 over 2 weeks rather, or a month.
Instead of 30 seconds.
Instead of 30
which
seconds.
Is what we would normally see for a standard earthquake.
I noticed that these seem to generally occur from the middle of, say, the Olympic Peninsula and then down dip to the east, further down. And this is a zone where, well, describe what's going on there. Why do we have it there and not further to the west?
Right. So the brittle part of the interface, the megathrust interface, where we have magnitude 9s event that occur in Cascadia, they happen fairly shallow on our megathrust. These events that we're seeing occurring right now are happening very deep, down some 30 kilometers deep beneath us here. So before we knew of these tremor and slow subevents, we didn't really know what was happening on the subduction interface at great depth. Down at that depth, we expect the rocks to be plastic or behave in a plastic way, so they shouldn't be tightly coupled. And as a result, we wouldn't expect earthquakes to extend that far deep. Yet here we finally see some activity, although very different than a normal earthquake. It does open the window of what's happening deep on the fault.
So perhaps a great earthquake in the brittle section further up dip might actually rupture down into this zone of transition, if you want to call it that, between the plastic and the solid,
Right.
and bring strong ground motion closer to our urban core.
It could, yeah. So there's been a lot of debate about what these tremor and slow slip mean in terms of the hazard for our region. And there are two trains of thought along that line. One is that the tremor and the slow slip demark the lower boundary. The other thought is that slow slip and tremor is a process that modulates the stress onto the shallow part of the megathrust. And there's some suggestion in numerical models that when we have slow slip events, that we're slightly passing stress back up to the shallow part of the subduction zone. So ETS might play an important role in how stress evolves in the lock zone on our megathrust.
So during these events, we're taking, say, half of the strain accumulated over 14 months or so and putting it back on the bottom end of the lock zone.
That's correct, yeah.
Relatively rapidly. I mean, it's still a
Yes.
couple of weeks,
Over a
but
couple
compared to what normal strain
Yes.
accumulation is, it's faster.
Yes, yeah, we don't load the lock zone at a nice linear rate
Yeah.
through time. We load it a lot right after the big earthquake, and then we kind of nudge it repeatedly with these slow slip and tremor events.
And I understand that forensic work done in Japan after the Tohoku earthquake indicated there was some slow slip on a patch of that subduction zone that occurred right before the magnitude 9 initiated.
Right, yeah, so there's some suggestion, there's data collected offshore that indicates there was a slow slip event happening in the weeks before, and the slow slip event seems to progress towards where the eventual rupture happened on their megathrust. What we don't know is whether that happens regularly, if that's the situation that always occurs, or would this just happen to be a one-time occurrence. We just don't have enough information yet to know what it means.
But we do know if we have a 500-year reoccurrence rate for magnitude 9 earthquakes in Cascadia, there are a whole lot of these slow slip events intervening before that big one comes. So it probably doesn't change the big picture, whether it's going to be this decade or 50 years away or 100 years away.
That's right. It's a very subtle nudge on the subduction zone. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
No problem.